Okay, now that we have our pirate hats and we are ready for chapter 10 on page 90, Anchors Away. Let's do this. Boing, boing, boing. That was Og's reaction when I told him about my experience in the library. Even though I didn't think he understood what a remote control is, he got in the general idea. And when I told him about the pirate hat, he splashed madly. I was in danger of getting soaked right there on our table. After Og settled down a little, I knew I should get some sleep. So I'd be alert and ready if I could have the chance to get into Richie's backpack the next morning. Still, I couldn't resist taking one more look at that beautiful boats my classmates worked on so hard. They looked seaworthy enough, thanks to Mr. Brisbane's advice. And they were beautiful with Mrs. Morgenstern's help. Gale's nautical flags were bright and colorful. So were the sails on the Chinese junk. But in the end, my favorite was the tall ship because it looked as if it really could sail far, far away. Standing in front of this wonderful boat was about as close as I was going to come to the adventure I'd been wishing for. I longed to be in a little bit closer. It couldn't hurt if I just crawled into the boat and pretended to sail for a minute or two, could it? I stood at the bow of the boat and tried to imagine what it would be like to be the captain of such a fine vessel. "Ready about," I squeaked. "Trim the sails, swab the decks." I admit, didn't know what all those things meant, but I had heard them in the books and the movies. "Lower the boom, batten down the hatches." It felt good to say those things. "Heave ho," I shouted. I heard Ugg splashing in the background, but I was hardly aware that I was in room 26. I don't know how long I spent pretending to be sailing. I only know that after a while, I suddenly fell asleep, sleepier than I've ever been. In fact, it must have been the fresh sea air that I was imagining. I turned and noticed a nice piece of sailcloth in the bottom of the boat. I decided that a short doze was in order, so I burrowed under the cloth and closed my eyes. I guess I was dreaming because I could see the boat gliding across the silver seas. And then the dream turned scary, 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 because I saw a pirate ship approaching. And there were real live pirates on board, wearing shiny red jackets with gold buttons and big pirate hats. "Turn back," I yelled. "Trim the sails. Flutter the gibbet. I don't know. I wasn't making much sense, but the words sounded pretty good. Suddenly, in my dreams, a huge wave came up and shook the boat. I was being violently tossed around by the waves. I was feeling slightly sick, too. And I heard the ship's bell chiming an odd sound. Boing, boing, scree! That's when I woke up. I pulled back the sailcloth just enough for me to see that I was moving out of room 26. Og had been trying to warn me, but I guess the cloth muffled the sound. I heard voices. "Can't I least carry it?" Richie begged. "Better if I do," Kirk replied. "Trust me." It took me a few sleepy moments to realize that I was still in the tall ship, which the boys were carrying to the bus for the trip to Potter's Pond. I was about to squeak up in protest when I thought that at least I had an opportunity for a real adventure. I was going to Potter's Pond, and maybe, just maybe, I'd still have a chance to disable Richie's remote. "Nice breezy day for sailing," I heard Mr. Brisbane say. I burrowed back under the cloth as my friends chattered away. Soon I felt the vibration of the bus. "Everybody find a seat." That, I knew, was a familiar voice of Mrs. Victoria, the bus driver. Screech! It's a good thing that I was already laying down in the bottom of the boat, or I would have surely been knocked over by the horrible sound of Mrs. Wright's whistle. If that was her idea of fun, I was already sorry I'd stowed away. "I am missing one permission slip," she announced. "This bus cannot leave the school without it. Is Richie Rinaldi on the bus?" "What?" "Repeat it, please," Richie's muffled voice replied. "Richie, I must have your permission slip or you will have to leave the bus," Mrs. Wright told him. It was mostly quiet, except for the shuffling of some papers. He must have been rummaging around in his backpack. Backpack! That's probably where he had the remote control, too. "I've got it," Richie said. A few minutes later, the bus rumbled away from the school on its way to Potter's Pond, with me on board. My friends were kind of noisy. They always are on the bus. Then I heard Mrs. Brisbane say, "Mrs. Wright, I think it would be fun if you led us in some songs." Mrs. Wright sounded surprised. "Me? Well, I could, I suppose, if you'd like me to." "I'd like you to," Mrs. Brisbane replied. I braced myself for the whistle. Screech! "All right, class. Everybody sing," Mrs. Wright commanded my friends. Everybody sang, probably to avoid from hearing that whistle again, as Mrs. Wright led them in song that was very, very, very noisy. "If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands." And everyone clapped. "If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands." And everybody clapped. "If you're happy and you know it, then your face will surely show it. If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands." Thunderous clapping. I clapped my paws too. Then I remembered Richie's backpack again. Was there any way for me to slip out of the boat and into the backpack without anyone noticing? Mrs. Wright blew her whistle again. Screech! "Keep it going, students," she barked, and they did. "If you're happy and you know it, stomp your feet." The students stomped in a way that would have gotten them in trouble had they been in class and not on the bus. I decided this was not the time to escape from the boat. "If you're happy and you know it, stomp your feet." Even louder stomping. I'm surprised the floor of the bus didn't collapse with all the stomping. But my friends and Mrs. Wright were having so much fun that they kept on going. They added a verse where everyone shouted, "We are!" And then another where everyone shouted three things. Everyone did all three things: clapping, stomping, and shouting, "We are!" As much fun as everyone was having, I was feeling quite miserable. I wanted to get to that remote control and stop Richie from getting in trouble. And I wanted to warn my friends that they might meet up with some unfriendly pirates. But I also knew that if Mrs. Wright discovered a small, unsanitary hamster on the bus, it would ruin everything. So I listened to the happy commotion and stayed put. Suddenly, the rumbling of the bus stopped. "Let's thank Mrs. Wright for making this trip so much fun," I heard Mrs. Brisbane say. My friends all cheered loudly, which must have made Mrs. Wright feel good. "All out for Potter's Pond," Mrs. Brisbane announced. There was so much noise, so much bumping and thumping, so much confusion that all I could do was lie low, hang on tight, and hope for the best. It took me a while to get everyone lined up. I heard the voices of some of the parents, like Heidi's mom, Miranda's dad, Gail's mom, Art's mom, and Saya's dad. This was some big party. At least Oh, at last, Mrs. Brisbane made the big announcement. Boys and girls, on the count of 3, set your boats on the water, she said. 1, 2, 3. Screech! Somehow, I wasn't surprised that Mrs. Wright blew her whistle to start the race. There was a big bump, a bigger thump, and then, oh my, I felt myself floating for the first time in my life. It felt like I was riding on a cloud. My classmates screamed, "Go, go, go!" Once I was used to the feeling of drifting on the water, I pushed the cloth back a little and peeked over the side of the boat. What a sight! Ahead of me, rippling blue water in the distance, a leafy green shoreline. On either side of me, my friends' boats, now afloat. Above me, sails gently rippling. I ventured up to the bow of the ship and felt the soft breeze against my fur. It was glorious. On the shore, my classmates were lined up on both sides of the pond, cheering their boats on. The ship was sailing so smoothly, I relaxed a little. I glanced behind me just in time to see the delicate swan boat that Saya and Miranda had worked so hard on rapidly sink out of view. There were moans and groans from the shore, and I groaned a little too. The pirate ship was next boat to go under. There were more groans, but others cheered for the remaining boats. I was getting nervous. Was my boat going to sink too? My tummy did a little flip-flop-flip, but my tall ship seemed to glide effortlessly through the water. I guess Kirk really did know what he was talking about. Oh, really did know what he was doing. The Chinese junk and the flag-filled sailboat were still in the water, but lagging far behind me. Even further back was the tip of the Viking ship, which was sinking rapidly. "Go!" my friends chanted. "Go!" Then suddenly I heard "Lower your voices, AJ," loud voice booming. "Humphrey Dumfrey's on the boat!" There was a gasp, and Mrs. Brisbane shouted, "Is it Humphrey? How did he get on the boat? Kirk, Richie!" In the distance, I heard Kirk say, "I don't know. He sounded confused. I didn't see him." Somebody's going to be in big trouble. Mrs. Brisbane didn't sound happy at all. If Mrs. Brisbane was right about hamsters getting wet, I was already in big trouble. But as the boat glided through the water, I felt freer than I ever had been. This was my greatest adventure yet, and I decided to enjoy it. Our next chapter is chapter 11. See you later. Bye.